The studio lights blazed across the stage as the audience cheered, waiting for Oprah's next guest. Cameras rolled, music faded, and the crowd settled. Then, from the side entrance, a man walked in, quietly, without fanfare. No designer suit. No bodyguards. No entourage of stylists trailing behind. Just a simple dark jacket, brown shoes that looked a few years old, and a calm, steady smile. Jonathan Roumie. For a moment, the crowd went silent, not because they recognized him, but because they didn't. He didn't look like a movie star. He looked like a school teacher who had taken the wrong turn and accidentally walked onto the most famous talk show in the world. Oprah smiled, her eyes filled with polite curiosity. "Well, this is a first," she joked lightly. "You didn't bring a PR team or even a cup of Starbucks." The audience laughed. Even Jonathan chuckled softly. He seemed unbothered, standing there with his hands folded gently in front of him. "Jonathan Roumie, right?" Oprah asked, flipping through her cards. "You're an actor?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "I am." Oprah raised her eyebrows, glancing at his plain outfit again. "Well, I must say, you might be the simplest actor we've ever had here." "No offense, none taken," Jonathan said, smiling. "Simplicity keeps me grounded." The crowd giggled again, unsure how to take him. Some whispered, "Is he serious?" Others smirked, thinking it was all a setup. Maybe a joke guest, or a spiritual speaker brought in to fill time. But behind that gentle smile was a story that would soon silence the laughter of every person in that room. Because in just a few moments, they would discover that the quiet man they'd underestimated was the face of one of the most impactful shows in the world. A man who had moved millions of hearts across continents, not through glamour or fame, but through faith, humility, and peace. And when they realized who he really was, the same audience that once laughed would rise to their feet in awe. What happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments in Oprah's studio history. The applause faded, and Oprah leaned back in her chair, still eyeing Jonathan with a mix of curiosity and amusement. The atmosphere in the studio was light, almost playful. The crowd expected a typical celebrity interview, stories about red carpets, fame, luxury homes, and Hollywood secrets. But as Jonathan sat down, something about him immediately shifted the energy in the room. He didn't carry that invisible weight of ego most stars did. No nervousness, no pretense, just quiet confidence. His eyes were calm and his movements were deliberate, as if every gesture had meaning. Oprah broke the silence first. "So, Jonathan," she began, glancing down at her cue cards, "you're an actor. Tell me a little about yourself. What brings you here today?" Jonathan smiled softly. "Well, I'm here because someone thought I had a story worth sharing. But honestly, I'm just grateful to be here." The humility in his tone made Oprah chuckle. "You're grateful to be here?" "Most people are fighting just to get an interview, Jonathan. You seem very grounded." He nodded. "Fame doesn't last forever, ma'am. But who you are underneath it, that's what matters," the audience murmured quietly. Some smiled. Others looked at each other, unsure whether to clap or wait for Oprah's response. "Okay, let me get this straight," Oprah said with that familiar teasing grin. "You don't have a stylist, a PR team, or even a personal assistant? You just came here alone?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I didn't think I needed much help to talk." The studio laughed again. Even Oprah laughed harder this time. "I like you already," she said. "But I have to say, you might be the simplest guest we've ever had on this show." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Simplicity isn't weakness, Ms. Winfrey. Sometimes it's strength in disguise." For a brief moment, there was silence. Something about the way he said it, slow, sincere, with no trace of arrogance, made everyone stop and listen. Oprah blinked. "That's actually beautiful. You don't hear that often in this industry." "I try to live by it," Jonathan said gently. "I don't need to impress anyone. I just want to serve through my work." A woman in the audience clapped quietly, starting a small wave of applause that spread across the studio. Jonathan bowed his head in thanks, still smiling humbly. Oprah, ever the curious interviewer, leaned forward. "So tell me, what kind of work are we talking about?" "Commercials? Films, theater?" Jonathan paused for a moment, then said, "Mostly film and television. A few projects that mean a lot to me." Oprah flipped to the next card on her lap. Strangely, it was blank. No list of upcoming movies, no film credits, no major awards. Her staff hadn't prepared much. That almost never happened. "Well," she said, improvising, "we'll get to that. But I have to say, you don't sound like most actors I've met. You sound more like a teacher. Or maybe even a preacher. Jonathan chuckled. I think we all have a little preacher inside us, especially when we've been through enough to learn what truly matters. The audience nodded. A few people smiled knowingly, as if his words had struck something deeper than expected. Then Oprah decided to steer the conversation toward humor again. Okay, Jonathan, serious question. You're in Hollywood, surrounded by fame, fortune, and temptation. You're telling me you don't have a big mansion, a sports car, or some flashy designer lifestyle? Jonathan's eyes twinkled. I drive a 2008 Honda Civic. It's old, but it's faithful. The crowd laughed again, louder this time. Oprah threw her head back, smiling. You've got to be kidding me. No one in this business drives a 2008 Civic. Jonathan smiled. That's fine. I'm not trying to fit into this business. I'm trying to live beyond it. His answer landed heavier than expected. The laughter softened into murmurs. You could feel the quiet respect beginning to form, though few realized it yet. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged puzzled looks. Who was this man? Why had he been invited? There wasn't much on the cards about him, just a note. Faith-based actor, growing global following. But Oprah could sense something different. Something she couldn't quite place. So, Jonathan, she asked, voice softening now. What drives you? What keeps you grounded in a world that constantly tries to lift you too high? Jonathan looked out at the audience before answering. Love, service, and knowing that every gift I have isn't really mine, it's borrowed. A hush filled the room. Even Oprah didn't reply right away. She simply nodded, her smile fading into quiet reflection. At that moment, the audience didn't see an actor. They saw something else. Someone different. And yet they still had no idea who he really was, because in a few moments, one unexpected revelation would turn that gentle calm into total astonishment. And Oprah's studio would never forget the name Jonathan Roumie again. The lights shimmered across the set, glinting off Oprah's gold bracelet as she leaned forward, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. Jonathan sat calmly across from her, hands loosely folded, posture relaxed, as if he were having tea in a friend's living room instead of being broadcast to millions. The audience had warmed up to him, though the tone still carried a hint of amusement. They saw him as a gentle, curious guest, maybe a motivational speaker or a small-time actor. But not someone important, not someone who could change the temperature of an entire room with a single sentence. Oprah smiled, turning to the crowd. Can you believe this, everyone? A Hollywood actor who says he doesn't care about fame, fortune, or followers? Jonathan, you might be an endangered species. Laughter rippled through the studio. Jonathan smiled, not offended, not defensive. Just peaceful. He replied softly. Fame can be a mirror, Oprah. But most people only look at their reflection, not at what's behind it. The laughter dimmed. A few heads tilted. Oprah blinked. That was not the kind of line she usually heard from guests. She leaned closer. That's an interesting way to put it. You sound like you've lived through a lot. Jonathan nodded gently. Enough to know that the world worships noise, but it's silence that changes people. For a moment, the studio felt different, heavier, deeper. You could hear the faint hum of cameras, the quiet shifting of audience seats. Then Oprah, ever the professional, smiled again and tried to lighten the tone. Well, I think we can all agree you're unique. But tell me something, Jonathan. Do you ever feel like you're missing out? The parties, the red carpets, the awards? He chuckled softly. I think the world confuses being seen with being known. I don't mind if the lights pass me by, as long as the message stays. The audience clapped, small at first, then louder. A wave of applause that surprised even Oprah. She smiled. You've got a calmness about you, like you've already figured something out the rest of us are still trying to learn. Jonathan shook his head. I'm still learning too. Every day. But I try to remember, and pride makes you loud. Grace makes you still. Somewhere backstage, a young producer named Hannah whispered to her colleague, Who is this guy? Why haven't I heard of him? Her partner shrugged. I think he's from some small show, Chosen or something like that. I didn't even find his Instagram verified. But then, just as she said it, Hannah's earpiece buzzed. A voice came through from the control room. Hey, double-check that guest profile. Something's off. You might want to pull up his bio again. She frowned and started typing rapidly on her tablet. What she saw next made her eyes widen. Back on stage, Oprah was still deep in conversation. "So, Jonathan," she said, smiling playfully, "you said you act for a living, but you talk like a philosopher. What kind of roles do you play?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment. His smile stayed gentle. "I try to play people who bring light, people who remind others what love looks like." The audience smiled softly. A few clapped again. Oprah grinned. "Well, I can see why people like you've got that peaceful energy everyone's talking about lately." Just then, Hannah rushed toward the stage entrance, whispering urgently to the floor director. The director's face changed instantly. Within seconds, a small note was scribbled and passed to Oprah's assistant, who discreetly slid it into her hand. Oprah glanced down mid-sentence. Her voice faltered for the first time that day. The note read, "Jonathan Roumie, lead actor portraying Jesus in The Chosen, the world's most watched faith-based series." Viewed over 500 million times globally, Oprah froze. Her lips parted slightly and she looked up at him again. Really looked this time. The studio lights gleamed on Jonathan's calm face, and suddenly the simplicity made sense. The man sitting across from her wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a newcomer. He was the face of a global phenomenon, a man millions saw as the modern image of Christ. The audience sensed the shift. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Wait, that's the guy from The Chosen. Oh my God. No way, that's him." Oprah's expression softened, the laughter gone, replaced with awe. She said quietly, "You're that Jonathan Roumie?" Jonathan nodded gently. "Yes, ma'am. But I'm still just Jonathan." The room went completely silent. Cameras zoomed in. Even the air felt heavy, like everyone had just realized they'd been sitting in front of someone who carried not just fame, but faith itself. And as Oprah sat back in stunned silence, she whispered the words the microphone still caught. "I think we've been talking to humility itself." The crowd erupted in applause, not the loud, shallow kind meant for entertainment, but the kind that comes from the heart. But for Jonathan, the moment wasn't about glory. He simply bowed his head and said, "Thank you, but all I did was show up as myself." And though the audience didn't yet know it, the real story of that day was only beginning. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The studio lights hummed softly above. The cameras kept rolling, but the laughter that once filled the air had disappeared. Oprah stared at the paper in her hand. The note with Jonathan's name and the words, "Lead actor portraying Jesus in The Chosen." The same man sitting before her, with the quiet smile and the humble clothes, was at the heart of one of the most watched series in the world. A series that had touched lives, restored faith, and crossed cultural barriers like no Hollywood blockbuster ever could. The audience, too, had caught on. The murmurs grew. People began whispering, leaning closer, confirming it with the person next to them. "That's really him. He's Jesus from The Chosen." Oh my God. No way. Someone from the back even stood up, clapping. It started with one person, hesitant, unsure if it was the right time. Then another joined. Then a few more. Within seconds, the entire studio was standing, clapping, cheering, not out of celebrity worship, but out of respect. Jonathan didn't react dramatically. He didn't stand up or wave. He simply lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging not their applause, but the spirit of what they had just realized. Oprah, still stunned, took a deep breath. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice trembling with awe. "I had no idea. You're the man who plays Jesus." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Yes, ma'am. That's the role I was trusted with." "Trusted with," Oprah repeated, almost whispering. "That's such a powerful way to put it." He nodded. "Because it's not a role you own. It's a responsibility you carry, and it's heavier than people might think." The audience grew silent again, a respectful, reverent silence. You could almost feel hearts slowing down, breath sinking, as if everyone was afraid to break the moment. Oprah looked at him for a long time before speaking again. "You know, when you walked in, I saw a man who seemed ordinary, but now I understand. You didn't need to shine because something in you already does." Jonathan chuckled softly. "We all have light in us, Oprah. Some people just forget to keep it lit." The simplicity of his answer hit her harder than any celebrity confession ever had. You could see it in her face, that shift from admiration to introspection. Then, from the corner of the studio, An audience member raised her hand. Oprah, breaking her usual protocol, nodded for her to speak. The woman's voice shook slightly as she said, "Mr. Roumie, my husband and I started watching The Chosen during a hard time in our marriage. We found hope again because of it." "Thank you." Jonathan turned toward her, eyes gentle. "I'm just an actor. The message belongs to all of us. I'm glad it helped you." You could see tears forming in several eyes across the audience. Even Oprah dabbed hers discreetly. It wasn't just a talk show anymore. It had turned into something deeper, something sacred. Behind the cameras, crew members who had been adjusting lights or holding microphones paused, drawn in by the silence that now felt almost spiritual. Jonathan continued softly, "You know, people often ask me what it's like to play Jesus, but the truth is, it's not about pretending to be him. It's about remembering what he stood for: kindness, forgiveness, and humility. And if I can live even a fraction of that off-screen, then I'm doing my job." Oprah nodded slowly, her usual commanding voice replaced with warmth. "That's beautiful. And it explains everything. The simplicity, the calmness, the way you carry yourself. It all makes sense now." Jonathan smiled. "I think simplicity reminds us that love isn't complicated. We just make it that way." The crowd clapped again, softer this time, more emotional. Then Oprah leaned forward, resting her elbows on her chair, and said something unexpected. "You've made me rethink how I see humility. I thought simplicity meant lack, but maybe it means peace." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly. The richest people aren't those who have more. They're those who need less." That line hit everyone. You could hear quiet gasps, see heads nodding in agreement. A camera zoomed in on Oprah's face, the queen of conversation, humbled in her own studio. She looked at Jonathan with newfound respect and said, "I think today I've been interviewed instead." The crowd laughed softly, breaking the heaviness with warmth. Jonathan chuckled. "We're all students, Oprah, every day. Life's the best classroom." The tension eased. The energy in the room shifted from awe to peace. What had started as laughter at a simple guest had transformed into a collective moment of reflection, a reminder that greatness doesn't always enter with applause. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing old shoes and a soft smile. By the time the cameras cut to commercial, no one moved. People just stood there clapping again, wiping tears or sitting in quiet thought. Backstage, a producer whispered, "This wasn't an interview. It was an awakening." And Oprah herself, as she took a sip of water, whispered under her breath, "Now that was a real moment." But Jonathan didn't bask in it. He simply stood, bowed slightly, and said with humility, "I'm grateful for the chance to share light." And when he walked off stage, the applause followed. Softer now, almost sacred, like the echo of gratitude itself. When the cameras came back from commercial, the studio felt different. Gone was the casual talk show energy, the laughter, the teasing, the light-hearted rhythm. What replaced it was something raw, something real. Even Oprah felt it. You could see it in the way she sat, not as the host of the most watched show in America, but as a woman sitting across from a man who had stirred something deep inside her. She smiled, softer now, and said quietly, "Jonathan, I've interviewed presidents, movie stars, spiritual leaders, but there's something different about you, something I can't quite name." Jonathan smiled, his eyes kind, reflective. "I don't think it's about me, Oprah. I think it's about what we all forget, that peace isn't found in fame or power. It's found in presence." The studio went silent again. His words weren't loud, but they carried the kind of weight that silences even the busiest minds. Oprah tilted her head, genuinely curious now. "You really live like this every day? So simple, so calm, so free?" Jonathan nodded. "I try to. I live modestly. I still rent a small apartment. I cook my own meals. I spend time praying, painting, talking to people on the street. I think when we strip away everything we don't need, we finally see what matters." The audience was spellbound. You could almost hear them breathing, slow, steady, synchronized. Oprah leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. "But Jonathan, why? You've achieved success. You're famous now. You could have anything you want. Why live so simply?" Jonathan smiled faintly, his eyes distant, almost nostalgic. "Because I've seen what happens when people forget who they are chasing what they think they need. Fame is like a flame, beautiful, bright, but it burns fast. If you stand too close, it consumes you. So I keep my distance. That line, "I keep my distance," echoed through the room. He continued softly, "The role I play, portraying Jesus, isn't just about acting, it's about reflecting something far greater. And you can't reflect light if you're obsessed with your own shadow." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Even Oprah's lips parted slightly in awe. "That's powerful," she whispered. Jonathan smiled humbly. "It's not mine. The wisdom isn't from me. I just try to live what I've learned." A woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. Another man clasped his hands together like he was in church. Oprah, visibly moved, took a deep breath and said, "I think you just gave everyone here something we didn't even know we were missing." Jonathan shook his head gently. "We're all looking for peace, Oprah. We just search for it in noisy places. But peace is quiet. It waits for us in stillness." The crowd clapped again. Slow, emotional applause that came not from excitement, but from reverence. Then Oprah asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Jonathan, when people treat you differently, when they see you as the man who plays Jesus, and does it ever feel like too much? Like a burden?" Jonathan exhaled softly. "Sometimes. But I remind myself I'm just a vessel. The moment I start believing I am the light instead of just carrying it, that's when I lose it." Oprah smiled through glistening eyes. "That's humility, and I think that's what makes you extraordinary," he replied, almost whispering. "Humility doesn't make you smaller. It makes room for something greater to move through you." The audience clapped again, this time standing. People were crying. Some held hands. A few bowed their heads. It wasn't a talk show anymore. It had turned into something closer to a collective awakening. Oprah stood up too, unable to stay seated. She looked at Jonathan, smiled, and said, "You've reminded me of something I learned years ago, that real greatness has nothing to prove." "It just is," Jonathan smiled, "and it never shouts. It just loves." The audience erupted in applause again. Then Oprah, still emotional, said with a playful but sincere tone, "You know what, Jonathan? I think you've just preached the most powerful sermon this stage has ever seen, and I don't even have a church." Everyone laughed gently, not the mocking laughter from earlier, but warm, healing laughter, the kind that comes after truth has been spoken. Jonathan laughed too. "We don't need walls to have church, Oprah. We just need people willing to listen." The cameras caught Oprah smiling deeply, a rare kind of smile, one that wasn't for television but for the soul. As the segment neared its end, she turned to the audience and said, "I invited a guest today, and I think I just met a messenger." Jonathan looked at her, bowed his head slightly, and replied, "We're all messengers. Some just forget the message." The studio fell silent one last time. You could feel the weight of the moment, that sense that something unforgettable had just happened. When the cameras finally cut, Oprah reached across the table, took Jonathan's hand, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing peace into this room." Jonathan simply smiled. "Thank you for giving it space to breathe. And just like that, no fireworks, no dramatic ending." He stood, waved softly to the crowd, and walked off the stage. But every person in that audience knew one thing for certain. They had come expecting entertainment, and left with enlightenment. The applause lingered even after the red recording light faded. People weren't clapping for a celebrity. They were clapping for a feeling. For the first time in a long time, something pure had filled that studio. The crew stood still, unsure what to say or do next. The air carried a strange peace, gentle, almost sacred, the kind that doesn't belong to a soundstage but to a sanctuary. Oprah remained seated as Jonathan rose slowly from his chair. For a second, she just watched him. Her face, which so often radiated command and charisma, now reflected something different. Stillness. She finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "Jonathan, I don't say this often, but you changed the atmosphere in here." Jonathan smiled kindly. "It wasn't me. Sometimes truth just needs a moment to breathe." The audience, reluctant to leave, stayed clapping. Some waved. Others simply stood with their hands over their hearts. Even the camera operators, hardened professionals who had seen hundreds of shows and felt their throats tighten. As the stage lights dimmed and the crew began to move, Oprah walked over and gently touched Jonathan's arm. "Come with me," she said quietly. They walked backstage together, through the maze of corridors lined with posters of icons who had once sat in that same seat. Presidents, billionaires, global superstars. But none of those faces seemed to matter right now. Inside Oprah's private lounge, the noise of the world faded. She poured 2 glasses of water, handed one to him, and said, "You know, I've spent decades interviewing people. I can tell when someone's performing, when they're building an image. But you don't seem to have one." Jonathan chuckled lightly. "That's probably because I stopped chasing one a long time ago." Oprah tilted her head. "Why?" He took a slow sip, then looked up at her. "Because images fade. But integrity doesn't. When you stop trying to look important, you finally become available to what truly is." Oprah smiled, deeply moved. "That's wisdom, Jonathan." "Real wisdom." He shrugged gently. "It's experience. Mostly from falling and getting back up." They both laughed softly. A quiet, knowing laugh that only people who had been through life's storms could share. Then Oprah leaned back in her chair and sighed. "You know, I built my career celebrating people's stories. But I think sometimes I got too caught up in the noise of it. The applause, the ratings, the headlines. Talking to you today reminded me what storytelling really is." Jonathan smiled. "It's not about telling stories at people. It's about helping them find their own." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was healing. Then Oprah looked at him, her expression gentle but serious. "Jonathan, you've got a rare gift. Not just as an actor, but as a mirror. You reflect peace back to people." He nodded slightly. "Peace isn't something we perform. It's something we protect." She wrote the line down on a notepad beside her, something she almost never did. "That's going on my wall," she said with a smile. A knock came at the door. One of the producers. "Ms. Winfrey, the next segment's ready when you are." Oprah waved them off. "Just a minute." Then she turned back to Jonathan. "I know we're out of time, but before you go, let me say this. You reminded me today why I started all of this in the first place, not for fame. Not for success, but to create moments that matter." Jonathan smiled, stood and extended his hand. "Then your purpose is already fulfilled, Oprah. You just have to keep doing it quietly." She took his hand, holding it for a second longer than usual. "You really are something special, Jonathan Roumie." He smiled humbly. "I'm just trying to be someone useful." As he left the room, Oprah watched him walk down the corridor, slow, calm, unhurried. No phone in hand, no assistant guiding him, just a man at peace with himself. When the door finally closed, Oprah looked around her empty lounge. The awards, the photos, the shining symbols of success, and whispered to herself, maybe simplicity isn't the absence of more. Maybe it's the presence of enough. Back on the studio floor, crew members talked quietly. One said, "I've never seen Oprah that quiet before." Another replied, "It wasn't silence. It was respect." Outside, as Jonathan stepped into the cool evening air, the sun was setting, streaks of orange and gold stretching across the sky. He looked up, smiled faintly, and whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you." And in that moment, it was clear, the true interview hadn't been between Oprah and Jonathan. It had been between humility and the world that had forgotten what it looked like. The next morning, the clip from Oprah's interview flooded the internet. Within hours, it was everywhere, on news sites, social media feeds, and YouTube thumbnails that read, "Oprah speechless after Jonathan Roumie's words on simplicity." Millions clicked, expecting entertainment. But what they found was a moment that felt like a prayer. People weren't talking about glamour or gossip. They were talking about peace, humility, and the strange power of quiet strength. In a world obsessed with noise, Jonathan had reminded everyone that silence still speaks. The morning after, Oprah sat in her office the next morning, staring out the window as the city below pulsed with chaos, horns, phones, headlines. She had done thousands of interviews, but this one felt different. It wasn't a show. It was a sermon wrapped in stillness. Her assistant entered with a tablet. "You've gone viral again," she said. Oprah smiled faintly. "Not me, sweetheart. Him." She scrolled through the comments. Lines upon lines of people thanking Jonathan for saying what so many had forgotten, that success isn't measured by followers, but by faith. Not by attention, but by intention. One comment stood out. "He made me realize I've been trying to impress people who don't even see me. I'm done performing. I just want peace." Oprah put down the tablet, closed her eyes, and whispered, "That's what real influence looks like." Meanwhile, somewhere quiet, Jonathan sat on a park bench sipping coffee from a paper cup, his phone buzzing endlessly beside him, messages from networks, agents, journalists. He didn't reply to any of them. He just watched a little boy feed pigeons, laughing every time they fluttered too close. A woman walked by and stopped. "Excuse me. Are you?" He smiled gently. "Yes, but right now I'm just someone enjoying the morning." She laughed softly. "You changed my week." "Thank you," he nodded. Then it was worth it. And that was Jonathan Roumie. No performance, no spotlight, just presence. The lesson. That stayed days turned into weeks, but people still talked about that interview. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Students quoted him in essays. Pastors referenced his words in sermons. Even corporate leaders replayed the clip before meetings, reminding their teams that humility isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And somewhere deep down, people began to realize something profound. We chase validation because we forget our value. We try to be seen, not realizing we already are. Jonathan had shown the world that peace doesn't come from being known. It comes from knowing yourself. Oprah's reflection. Months later, Oprah revisited that episode during a special segment called Conversations That Changed Me. She replayed the moment Jonathan said, "Peace isn't something we perform. It's something we protect." Then she looked directly into the camera and said, "We live in a culture where everyone's shouting to be heard. Louder, faster, bigger. But sometimes the real voice is the quiet one. The one that doesn't demand attention but commands respect." She paused, her tone softer. Jonathan Roumie reminded me, and maybe all of us, that the greatest power we'll ever have is humility. Because when you stop needing to prove who you are, you finally become who you were meant to be. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. They just listened. And in that silence, the truth landed. Respect isn't something you give to impress the powerful. It's something you show because it reveals your own power. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less, and simplicity, it's not a lack of ambition. It's the mastery of knowing what really matters. Because one day all the applause will fade. The titles, the awards, the spotlight, gone. But the impact of kindness, integrity, and quiet faith, that stays forever. Message to the audience, so wherever you're watching this from, your living room, your phone, or somewhere between chaos and calm, take a moment to breathe. Remember, you don't have to be famous to be meaningful. You don't have to be rich to be respected, and you don't have to be loud to be heard. The strongest souls are often the quietest ones, and the most powerful people are those who don't need to prove a thing. If you believe in humility over hype, if you believe peace is stronger than pride, type respect in the comments, because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more hearts like Jonathan Roumie's, steady, sincere, and silently changing everything they touch.